There are fates in history that make death seem like mercy. What happened to the nuns of Thessaly beneath the Ottoman palace walls was one of them. High in the mountains where olive groves trembled in the autumn wind, the bells of a small convent rang for the last time. Sister Eleni stood before a cracked fresco of saints whose faces had been scraped away by centuries of sorrow, clutching a silver crucifix that had survived 100 years of storms. On the horizon, fire shimmered. Red Ottoman banners fluttered like sparks across the valley, and every woman in that chapel knew exactly what they meant. No soldiers remained to protect them. No riders came from the towns below. Only the stillness before conquest, heavy and absolute. When the gates finally shattered under cannon fire, the hymns that had filled those sacred halls were drowned by iron and screams. The Ottomans did not waste arrows on holy places. They wanted something far more valuable than treasure or relics. They wanted proof that even God could be conquered. By nightfall, the surviving sisters were herded into the courtyard, their white robes glowing like ghosts in the torchlight. They were told they would be taken before the Pasha, a promise few captives ever lived to see fulfilled. But as dawn broke and smoke rose from the refectory where they had once shared bread in silence, something unexpected happened. The soldiers waiting for cries of mercy heard singing instead. Bound with rope and surrounded by armed men, the nuns began to chant the Agnus Dei. Their voices trembled but never broke. The Ottoman captain dragged the abbess forward and offered her a choice. Renounce your God and accept ours, and your sisters will live. Her answer sealed all their fates. I have already given my life, she whispered. What else can you take? What followed was never written in full. Even Ottoman records, which glorified every victory, described it only as discipline for those who refused reason. By midday, the convent bells had been melted for coin, and the rooftop cross shipped east as a trophy. But the women were not killed. That would have been mercy. Instead, 22 nuns in torn habits were driven south toward the coast, ankles bound, watched by horsemen who saw them not as prisoners of war, but as symbols. Proof that even sacred walls could fall. The journey was merciless. When one sister collapsed from thirst, another lifted her veil so the soldiers would not trample it. A final act of dignity in a world stripped of all mercy. After 7 days, they reached the port and were herded onto Ottoman galleys, wrists shackled to wooden benches where criminals and slaves once sat. As the sails caught wind and the shores of Greece faded into the horizon, everything they had ever known disappeared with it. If stories like this pull you into the darkest corners of history, subscribe. It helps us uncover more of the accounts buried in archives, the ones that were meant to stay forgotten, because some truths are too important to erase. The voyage to Constantinople lasted 12 days. Storms lashed the deck. Salt stung their wounds. Hunger hollowed their faces. But what broke them most was not the pain. It was the silence. No one spoke to them except to bark commands. They existed like ghosts, drifting between sky and sea. At night, the youngest among them, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms beneath her breath. Her voice was faint, barely audible over the crashing waves, but even the chained prisoners around her turned their heads to listen. For a moment, the sea seemed to still. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rise before them, its domes and minarets glowing like blades in the dawn. They were paraded through narrow streets lined with merchants and slaves, past the ancient walls toward the imperial district. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had been transformed into a mosque, they were forced to kneel. Inside the marble halls of the Divan, the imperial council, they stood before the Grand Vizier. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had granted mercy on one condition: accept conversion and receive new names, food and life within the palace, refuse and face the discipline of faith. A phrase that could mean imprisonment, labor, or something far worse. None of them spoke. When the guards moved to drag Sister Magdalena forward, an elder named Sister Dearest stepped out of line. She addressed the vizier not as a captive, but as someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and decay. "You may rename us," she said calmly, "but you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry." The interpreter hesitated. When he translated her words, the vizier's face remained unreadable. Then he replied coldly, "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a motion of his hand, the sisters were dismissed, not to execution but to the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were kept. What came next was not death. It was erasure. They were stripped of their habits, clothed in rough garments, and told they would now serve. Cleaning floors, sewing garments, feeding fires for the chambers above. It was meant to break them, to turn holiness into servitude. But these were women who had already lived under vows of silence and denial. Hunger and solitude were nothing new. At night they prayed in secret. One carved a cross into the clay wall with her fingernail. Another traced verses into the dust beneath her straw bed. Days bled into months. Their names were forbidden. Each woman was given a number, a mark of ownership. Some gave in. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally whispered the words of submission. They were dressed in silk and taken away, never to be seen again. For those who remained, each disappearance hardened their resolve. When guards demanded answers, they gave only silence, and in that silence they reclaimed what the empire thought it had taken. By the time a new sultan rose to power, only a handful remained. In the palace archives, where every servant was meticulously recorded, there was a gap, 21 entries that should have been. The ledger read only, "Unfit for service, disposed." No dates, no burial records, nothing. This was how history erased them, not with fire, but with withheld ink. Centuries later, excavators exploring beneath Topkapi uncovered a small sealed chamber lined with Christian carvings, crosses scratched into stone, a Latin phrase half erased by time, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness, silent proof that their prayers had never stopped, that even in a place designed to erase them, they had left a mark, a whisper of women who refused to be forgotten. If you heard their story tonight, let it stay with you. Tell us in the comments what you felt when you learned what they endured, because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how deeply they were buried.